What is your darkest family secret? My grandfather was killed in a bar when my father was still a toddler. The official story was that he was murdered over a pinball game. Back then pinball was pretty serious, I guess. It wasn't until recently my grandmother confessed, on her deathbed, that my grandfather actually killed someone and buried the body, days before his own demise. So he was actually killed in retaliation for a murder that he committed. My grandmother kept this secret for almost 65 years. A male blood relative went to prison for drug dealing and major theft. Whilst in prison he was diagnosed with Hep C, likely from sharing needles. When he got out of prison, he violated his 13-year-old stepdaughter. There's a high likelihood that he violated his other daughters. One died from a drug overdose and the other committed suicide. He died in prison from Hep C complications and liver cancer. A not too distant cousin messed over his notoriously dangerous bikie gang in a big way, including forcing himself on someone's wife and stealing a high-up motorbike, and has been on the run for the last 20 years. A year or two after her adoptive mother died, my mom went looking for information about her birth parents, and found that her birth mom and her husband had been gruesomely murdered by a drug cartel. There was an article about their murder in Rolling Stone magazine that had gory pictures of their bodies. It's me. My dad never told his family I existed. I was shameful, maybe he was more ashamed. After he died they found out about me and kindly asked me not to come to the funeral. I get why he never told them. My dad gave a job to a cousin. I remember as a kid that this cousin I'd never heard of just suddenly popped up out of nowhere without explanation, but I was a kid so didn't really think of it, but everyone made a big deal out of how great it was for my dad to give him a job. I found out 20 years later that he'd been in prison for having a sexual relationship with a student. Father won the lottery and we've been pretending to be poor so our family doesn't try to ask for money. My dad's cousin killed a dude and his 9-year-old son in a cocaine rage in 1990. He was living in my parents' basement at the time. Investigators first questioned my dad, and then they found my cousin's bloody shoes in the house. The dude used to babysit me and my siblings. I didn't know any of this until I was almost an adult. He used to call me from prison on our shared birthday and it always gave me the creeps. Stopped answering when I discovered the truth. My dad and grandma swear he is innocent, but I read into the case. He's definitely not. Edit. A word edit number 2. For anyone morbidly curious linked to the case reading over it, I realize I was mistaken about the shoes. He actually washed and handed them over to the cops. What a dummy. My cousin, once removed, my parents' cousin, was kidnapped, violated, and tortured by a serial killer. She was, after many days, dropped off near a running path with her neck slit. She lived, unlike the other 3, and she could lead the police to his home. He is still in prison. As a child I heard whispering of it and didn't find out the whole truth until I was older. Edit. Not great aunt. Second cousin. Edit. My cousin, once removed. My great-grandfather shot and killed a man in his grocery store back in the 30s over a poker game. He ran a speakeasy out of the back of his store and lost almost $2,000. So as the guy was walking out the front after the store closed he shot him and got away with it by telling the police the man robbed him. It wasn't until he was on his deathbed he told my grandfather what had happened. Edit. This was in Ohio. My great-uncle was born from his sister being violated by her father. The family said basically she had just been a loose lady and not right in the head. They locked her up in the attic. After my great-uncle passed, my mother and I went into the multi-generation house to clean it out. The door to the attic, where sister mom was kept but long since passed. The door had an outside lock. No creepy claw marks or anything, but it was just so sad. My mom pulled the lock off and announced to the house that she would never be shut away again. One family member killed another by leaving a bag of poisoned donuts on the front steps. We are now hesitant about accepting donuts. I had an uncle who moved far away, worked in a boiler room at a huge casino, decades ago. He was always sketchy, and he had way more money than a simple boiler room employee ought to have had. Rumors that the boiler room was a really useful thing for the mob, due to boilers doubling as incinerators for certain purposes. Hence the money. Many unanswered questions there. As part of opening a home daycare, Mom found somebody on the sex offender registry with our family's very unusual last name. Mom called Grandpa. He confirmed that he is related to us. He hadn't seen him in decades. He didn't know he had been convicted for statutory but thought that sounded about right. We're not supposed to ask about him again. In the film Driving Miss Daisy, when the chauffeur, played by Morgan Freeman, is driving Miss Daisy to worship service, they get stuck in a traffic jam. He gets out to see what the holdup is. When he gets back in, he says you won't be going to service today. Somebody done bombed the temple, Hebrew Benevolent Congregation Temple, Atlanta, 1958. She says what? Who would do such a thing? My uncle, that's who. My grandfather was an English and Russian speaking citizen of Germany during World War II. He said he fixed planes. I later found out that he was paperclipped into Canada, technically matchboxed when it's Canada, and actually worked on a lot of the early rocket programs before becoming a farmer. We've only been able to find a few people with our last name in historical documents or currently living. In history, one man with my last name was executed for war crimes, scuttling U-boats at the end of the war, and the other people with my very German last name live in Argentina. So while I can't piece a lot together of what actually happened, it seems the branches of my family trees are shaped like swastikas. Edit. Lots of people have similar stories of grandparents that were active in the war, and it's nothing to be ashamed of. Learn from the mistakes that they made. Look at what's happening in the world today and choose to be part of the good. Also, I think it's kinda cool that my grandfather was a force for good after being a part of something so terrible. It's interesting to see that he was obviously very smart and capable, but chose the life of a farmer after everything was done. We were slightly worried about finding old uniforms and flags after he passed away, or seeing all his money go to long lost relatives in Argentina, but nothing like that happened. My brother shot himself in the leg to get out of Iraq and tried to blame it on an enemy attack. I learned about this the day I arrived in Afghanistan for my year-long tour. All I heard was that he was shot. I found out later it was a self-inflicted wound and he was out on suicide watch and was kicked out with a less than honorable discharge. He's never actually told anyone this. I just heard it through the National Guard being kind of like a gossipy small town. Actually don't hold it against him. War sucked. He's absolutely ruined his life since then by becoming an alcoholic and sitting the world out. Just sad all around. Also, my mom and her sister are married the same man, so all my siblings are also cousins with each other. Dad's cousin was a prominent Catholic priest known for his staunchly anti-occult views. Well, it was quite the surprise when he was arrested trying to solicit a blowy from an undercover cop at a fruity bookstore in New Orleans. My grandma tried to kill my grandpa. My dad tells me that my grandpa was a controlling, emotionally abusive person and never let my grandma go out, even to church. But my dad also doesn't reveal much about the past. All I know is that there's a lot of resentment. Towards the end of his life, my grandpa had a stroke and was completely bedridden and couldn't speak. He was coherent and understood when we spoke to him. We had a full-time carrier for him who would bathe him, feed him, etc. because my grandma didn't want to. As it turns out, she was not giving him or the carrier any food. Later we also found out that she wasn't giving him his medicines and would ignore him for hours when he had fits. She would not give him the adult diapers and let him lay in his filth for days. Eventually, my uncle took him in and they took over his care, even though my aunt was recovering from breast cancer. He was doing well and recovered somewhat. My grandma sometimes visited him and asked to be left alone. Once the carrier caught her trying to strangle him, and she threatened to call the cops. She just stayed quiet while my uncle kicked her out. This worsened his condition, and he was in the ICU for a while. At some point when she visited him, my grandma had also broken his arm. We didn't know because he couldn't verbalize it. My dad died of a drug overdose when he was only 25. I was 6 months old. Our family and his hid the true reason and told everyone it was a heart attack. This is even what I grew up thinking. Only my mom, my aunt, 2 uncles, And my full grandparents knew the real cause. I found out the real cause of his death when I had to get his death certificate for college financial aid. And now I am burdened with continuing the light of the greater community who knew him. Edit. Holy hell, this blew up overnight. I am trying to respond to all comments, but apologies if I can't. And thank you for the awards. My great-great-grandmother had a black father and was considered really taboo in the 1860s. My great-grandmother is 98 years old and was telling us about a guy who was black and absolutely adored her in the 1920s and early 30s and would come over to play with her, but the family had to keep it a secret as he was black and she was white. Story goes that her grandmother married her grandfather. My great-grandmother's mom had to pretend that he worked as the help on the farm in South Dakota when he was really his father. She told us about it when my grandfather did a DNA test and it came back that he was part black and had black family members. We only found out last year. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did like it, please be sure to leave some feedback, whether by smashing the like button, commenting, or subscribing. Thanks, see you next video.